Before the age of the smartphone, before the internet connected every corner of the world, there was a time when computers were nothing more than strange, humming boxes locked inside laboratories. They were mysterious, inaccessible, and feared by most people. But somewhere in Seattle, a young boy stared into one of those machines, not with fear but fascination. His name was Bill Gates, and he saw something no one else could. To him, that flickering screen wasn't a machine, it was a doorway, a window into an invisible world that could reshape how humans think, work, and live. Long before the rest of the world cared about personal computers, Bill believed that someday there would be one on every desk in every home. It sounded impossible, and that's exactly why he pursued it. This is not the story of instant success. It is the story of obsession, of logic turned into art, and of a mind that believed ideas were more powerful than circumstance. It is the story of a boy who would grow into one of the most influential figures of the modern age, not because of luck, but because he refused to stop thinking. From his restless teenage years in computer labs to the global influence of Microsoft, from courtroom battles to philanthropic triumphs, this is the journey of how one man coded the blueprint for the digital world. A story not only of technology, but of vision, determination, and the quiet pursuit of perfection. And perhaps in this calm reflection of his life, we'll find more than the rise of a billionaire. We'll see the story of human progress, the endless dance between curiosity and creation. This is the story of Bill Gates, the boy who dreamed in logic and built the world we live in today. Before he became a billionaire or a symbol of innovation, Bill Gates was a quiet boy growing up in Seattle. He wasn't the kind of child who sought attention or applause. Instead, he was drawn to quiet places where ideas seemed louder than voices. His curiosity was constant, not about toys or games, but about systems, rules, and how things worked beneath the surface. To most people, it looked like daydreaming. To him, it was focus. Bill was born into a family that valued thinking. His father, William Gates Sr., was a towering man with a disciplined mind. His mother, Mary, was sharp and full of compassion, deeply involved in education and charity. Together, they created a home where questions were encouraged and answers were never simple. Dinner conversations often turned into debates, respectful but spirited. It was in those moments that Bill learned to think fast, to reason deeply, and to stand his ground. Unlike many children, Bill found comfort in logic. While others sought fun, he sought understanding. He would read for hours, lost in encyclopedias and math books, trying to see how one idea connected to another. There was a structure to everything in his mind, a quiet map forming behind his calm blue eyes. That was how he made sense of the world, through patterns, through rules, through logic. But even in his calm nature, there was a restless energy. Bill didn't want to just learn. He wanted to apply. He wanted to test the rules to see if they would bend. His teachers noticed early that he was brilliant, but also stubborn. He challenged authority, questioned instructions, and searched for better ways to solve problems. Sometimes it frustrated adults, but beneath that defiance was the same spirit that would one day redefine technology. At 13, a new possibility entered his world. His school, Lakeside, purchased a computer terminal, a rare and expensive machine at the time. Most students ignored it. To them, it was just a piece of equipment, humming quietly in the corner. But when Bill typed his first command, something shifted inside him. It was like meeting a kindred spirit, something that thought in pure logic, just like him. The computer didn't judge or interrupt. It responded with precision. Every line of code had meaning. Every error was a lesson. Bill was hooked immediately. He would spend hours experimenting, learning, and debugging programs late into the night. His teachers saw a boy obsessed, but Bill saw something else, a future where these machines could change the world. His fascination wasn't about the machine itself. It was about what it represented: control, logic, and creation. For the first time, he could build something from thought alone. No materials, no tools, just ideas. It was the purest form of invention. And as the soft glow of that terminal reflected on his face, Bill Gates, still a teenager, began to dream of a world where everyone everywhere could harness that same power. A world where computers wouldn't belong only to scientists, but to ordinary people. It was a dream that sounded impossible in 1968. But to the boy who loved logic, impossibility was just a problem waiting to be solved. Bill Gates was not born into poverty, nor was he born into luxury. He was born into structure, a home where ambition was not only expected but celebrated. His father, William Gates Sr., stood tall in both presence and principle. A respected lawyer, he believed that strength of mind was a family inheritance. His mother, Mary Maxwell Gates, was the heart of the family, warm, disciplined, and endlessly driven to make a difference in the world around her. Together, they built a household defined by purpose. The Gates home was a place of discussion. Every dinner became a stage for ideas, questions, and arguments. William Sr. would ask difficult questions, not to test his children, but to teach them how to think under pressure. Mary would remind them that intellect meant nothing without empathy. It was a balance between logic and compassion, the same duality that would later define Bill's life and career. Mary was more than a mother, she was a leader in her community. She served on boards, worked with schools, and believed that success was meant to serve others. She had a quiet but firm belief in discipline, the kind that came from hard work and consistency. From her, Bill learned that the world doesn't reward ideas alone. It rewards persistence. It rewards the ability to turn thought into action. His father, on the other hand, taught him structure and resilience. William Sr. was not easily impressed. He expected results and respected process. Bill admired him deeply, but also wanted to prove that intellect could outshine tradition. That silent desire to carve his own identity became an unspoken tension in the family. It wasn't rebellion, it was evolution. Bill didn't want to follow a path. He wanted to build one. Even in childhood, Bill displayed a quiet competitiveness. Whether it was a board game, a math test, or a family debate, he hated to lose. But it wasn't about winning for the sake of pride. It was about mastery, about understanding why he lost and how to fix it. That same mindset would later make him relentless in business, unable to accept imperfection from himself or others. The Gates parents supported their son's curiosity, but they also feared it might consume him. They saw a mind so powerful that it sometimes ignored the world around it. His focus was absolute, to the point where he could forget to eat or sleep when he was absorbed in solving a problem. It was brilliance, but it was also isolation. And yet, they never tried to stop it. They simply tried to shape it. As the years passed, Bill's intellectual confidence grew. Teachers called him gifted, but challenging. He questioned authority not to be rude, but because he genuinely wanted to know the reasoning behind everything. Rules were suggestions until proven logical. That trait, both admired and criticized, became his greatest asset and his greatest flaw. In the Gates family, ambition was not a word, it was a tradition. His parents didn't push him toward wealth or fame. They pushed him toward impact. They believed their son could change something, though they could never have imagined how much. And while many children dreamed of heroes, Bill dreamed of ideas, of systems, of structures, of worlds that could be built through logic alone. It was that dream, quietly forming at his family's dinner table, that would someday shape the digital world. In 1968, when Bill Gates was just 13 years old, something extraordinary arrived at his school, a computer terminal. At the time, computers were massive machines locked away in universities and corporations. They were mysterious, expensive, and far too advanced for most students to touch. But Lakeside School had secured access to one through a local company's donation. To most students, it was a novelty. To Bill, it was a revelation. He still remembered the first moment he typed a command. The machine didn't look impressive. No colorful screen, just a teletype printer clattering words onto paper. But when it responded to his instructions, something clicked. It was as if he had discovered a new language, one that spoke back to him with perfect logic. It didn't argue or hesitate. It simply obeyed reason. In that instant, Bill felt he had found a companion made of thought. What fascinated him most wasn't what the computer could do, but how it did it. Every result, every error, every delay was a clue. He wanted to know the logic behind the logic, the invisible structure that made this machine think. Hours turned into days, and days turned into nights. The school had to set time limits for usage, but Bill often found ways to stay longer, losing himself in the rhythmic hum of computation. There, in that quiet room filled with mechanical sounds, Bill discovered the kind of focus that few ever experience. Time disappeared when he was in front of the terminal. He wasn't learning because he had to. He was learning because he couldn't stop. It was the kind of obsession that defines genius, the line between passion and purpose fading into one. He wasn't alone in this fascination. A small group of students shared the same curiosity, including a soft-spoken boy named Paul Allen. Paul was older, calmer, and deeply thoughtful. While Bill attacked problems with intensity, Paul studied them with quiet depth. Their bond formed not through friendship, but through shared obsession. Together, they explored the limits of the machine, testing commands, breaking systems, and learning faster than their teachers could teach. To many, they looked like troublemakers, boys spending too much time in front of a screen. But to those who understood, it was clear that something profound was happening. They weren't playing. They were building the foundation of a new world. Each keystroke was a step toward the future, one they couldn't yet see, but instinctively believed in. Bill became known around the school as the computer kid. Teachers admired his intelligence, but worried about his intensity. His parents tried to balance pride with concern, yet even they sensed that this wasn't just another hobby. It was destiny unfolding. The boy who once found joy in puzzles had discovered the ultimate one, a machine that could think, if only he could teach it how. In that small room in Seattle, long before Microsoft, before Windows, before the Internet, a quiet revolution began. It didn't start with noise or crowds. It started with a boy, a keyboard, and an unshakable belief that logic could change the world. For most students, the school day ended when the bell rang. For Bill Gates and Paul Allen, it began when everyone else went home. The glow of the terminal, dim and steady, became their world after dark. While others played sports or watched TV, they chased code, endless lines of symbols that whispered possibilities. It wasn't work, it was discovery. The computer system they used had strict time limits, so Bill and Paul found clever ways around them. They learned how to exploit bugs, slipping into the system after hours. It wasn't mischief for its own sake, it was hunger, a need to keep learning. When the company that owned the terminal found out, they were banned from using it. But instead of punishment, something unexpected happened. The company saw their potential and offered them a deal, find bugs in the software, and they could have more computer time. It was an early lesson in opportunity, that curiosity, when directed, becomes value. Bill and Paul spent countless nights debugging code for free time. They weren't making money yet, but they were building mastery. By the time other students were still learning basic algebra, they were writing programs that most adults couldn't understand. Their world had shifted from books to binary, from rules to creation. As the nights stretched on, Bill developed an intense routine. He would lose himself in programming until dawn, sleep a few hours, then return to school as if nothing happened. It was unhealthy, even alarming to some, but it shaped him. Those sleepless nights built his endurance, a mental discipline that would define his future as a founder. To him, exhaustion was just the cost of progress. Paul, in contrast, worked with quiet patience. He studied how systems connected, how logic flowed between parts. Together, they formed a balance, Bill's relentless drive paired with Paul's deep understanding. It was a chemistry that would later power one of the greatest companies on earth. They didn't know it yet, but these nights were the rehearsal for something far bigger. What made these moments special wasn't just skill, but imagination. Bill didn't see the terminal as a machine. He saw it as a key to something vast and transformative. He began to dream that one day computers wouldn't live in rooms. They would live in homes. It sounded impossible at the time. Computers were too big, too expensive, too complex. But inside Bill's mind, the impossible was only temporary. By the time he reached his teenage years, he had already written programs for scheduling classes and managing school data. Teachers used them. Students relied on them. The machine that once fascinated him had now become his tool. A quiet shift had begun. The user was becoming the creator. Those long nights at Lakeside weren't just about learning to code. They were about learning to see, to look at limitations and imagine what could be built beyond them. Each hour spent at that terminal was another brick in the foundation of his future empire. The world still slept, unaware that, in a quiet school lab, two boys were shaping the dawn of the digital age. By the early 1970s, Bill Gates had become more than a curious student. He was a mind in motion. His world revolved around logic, efficiency, and precision. Yet beneath that analytical surface was something deeper, vision, the kind that doesn't come from books, but from belief. He began to imagine a world connected not by roads or wires, but by information, flowing through machines that could fit on a desk. Most people thought it was fantasy. Computers were the size of rooms and cost as much as houses. They were tools for corporations and scientists, not for ordinary people. But Bill saw the opposite. He believed that one day computers would be personal, intimate companions that could assist, calculate, and create. It was an idea so far ahead of its time that few could even picture it. Yet, in his mind, it was already real. He would spend hours talking about this future with Paul Allen. The two would walk around campus or sit in cafes, sketching out ideas for software that didn't exist yet. They dreamed of creating programs that would make computers accessible to everyone. Someday, Bill would say, every home will have one. Paul would smile, half skeptical, half inspired. It was an impossible dream, and yet it was starting to feel inevitable. Then, one afternoon, Paul brought him a magazine. On the cover was the Altair 8800, a new kind of computer kit. It wasn't just a giant machine for labs. It was small, cheap, and could be assembled at home. To most readers, it was a curiosity. To Bill and Paul, it was a sign. The world they had imagined was beginning to form. In that moment, everything changed. Bill's quiet dreams turned into a mission. They saw a gap. The Altair had hardware, but no real software. No one had written a proper programming language for it, and that was the opportunity they had been waiting for. If they could be the first to build that language, they could define how people interacted with these new personal computers. Without hesitation, they got to work. Bill called the company that made the Altair, claiming they had already written a version of BASIC for it, even though they hadn't. It was a bold move, part confidence, part gamble. But that single call opened the door to everything that would follow. They worked day and night, writing the code, testing it on paper before they ever saw the machine itself. When they finally sent it off, the result was nothing short of historic. Their program worked perfectly. The Altair came to life, and BASIC became the first widely used language for personal computers. For the first time, software had met hardware on equal ground. It was the spark that would ignite an empire. Bill and Paul didn't have a company yet. They didn't even have an office. But they had something far more powerful, proof that their vision could become real. The world hadn't noticed yet, but the personal computer revolution had just begun, born from two dreamers who refused to accept that the future was impossible. When Bill Gates and Paul Allen realized their Altair project had worked, they felt something shift. It wasn't just excitement, it was clarity. The world was about to change, and they could feel it. The code they wrote on scraps of paper had come alive inside a machine hundreds of miles away. For the first time, software had become the invisible force behind a revolution. Soon after, the calls began. Companies wanted versions of their program. Magazines wrote about it. The two young men, barely out of their teens, had become pioneers of an entirely new industry, personal computing. Bill and Paul knew that if they wanted to stay ahead, they needed to formalize what they had started. And so, in 1975, they gave their dream a name, Microsoft. The name was simple, a fusion of microcomputer and software. But behind that simplicity was something grand. It wasn't just a business, it was a mission. They wanted to put computing power into the hands of everyone. At the time, it sounded like a fantasy. But in their small, borrowed office in Albuquerque, New Mexico, two visionaries began to write the future. Bill took the lead in shaping Microsoft's structure. While Paul focused on technology, Bill became the strategist, the relentless thinker who pushed for perfection in every detail. He was known for his intensity. When others took breaks, he kept working. When others settled for good enough, he pushed for better. He had a mind wired for competition, but his goal wasn't to win against others, it was to win against limitation itself. The early days of Microsoft were raw, uncertain, and exhausting. They worked long hours on minimal sleep, surviving on coffee and belief. There was no roadmap, no blueprint to follow. Every day was a new challenge. Debugging, licensing, negotiating, and convincing hardware makers that software mattered. At that time, most companies didn't even think software had value. To them, the hardware was the product. Bill disagreed. He believed the real power lay in the invisible logic that made machines come alive. That belief became the foundation of Microsoft's philosophy. Control the software, and you control the platform. Bill understood something few others did, that computers would become universal, and whoever built the language everyone used would define the standard for the entire industry. This wasn't just business sense, it was foresight, the kind that turns entrepreneurs into legends. Paul often served as the voice of reason, tempering Bill's intensity with calm insight. Their partnership was imperfect but powerful, one driven by fire, the other by vision. Together they navigated the growing storm of the early computing world. They built partnerships, delivered programs, and slowly began to build a reputation that would soon stretch beyond the hobbyist scene. But beneath the excitement was something deeper, the feeling that they were standing on the edge of history. Every keystroke, every decision was shaping the future of technology. And Bill, still in his early 20s, carried that weight with unwavering focus. He was no longer the boy at the terminal. He was the leader of a movement. By 1977, Microsoft was growing faster than they could have imagined. Their software wasn't just for one machine anymore. It was being used across dozens of new computers. Each time a company licensed their code, Bill saw his vision come closer to life. A world where computers weren't isolated tools, but extensions of human thought. In that small office filled with noise, wires, and empty coffee cups, the seeds of the digital age had been planted. Microsoft wasn't yet a household name, but its spirit, ambition, innovation, and relentless drive had already taken root. The quiet revolution that began in a school terminal was now expanding into the world, one line of code at a time. By the early 1980s, Microsoft was no longer a small startup run by two dreamers. It was becoming a force, lean, ambitious, and obsessed with the future. But even as their business grew, Bill Gates knew that success could vanish overnight. The computing world was shifting fast. New machines, new competitors, and new ideas appeared every month. To survive, Microsoft had to do more than adapt. It had to lead. The company's biggest break came in 1980 when IBM, the giant of the computer world, approached Microsoft for an operating system. IBM was preparing to release its first personal computer, the IBM PC. They needed software to run it, and they needed it quickly. Bill, only 24 at the time, saw this not just as a contract, but as a gateway to something far greater. He made a bold move. Microsoft didn't have an operating system yet, but Bill promised they could deliver one. Then, instead of building from scratch, he made a quiet deal to purchase an existing system from a small developer, QDOS, or Quick and Dirty Operating System. Microsoft modified it, improved it, and renamed it MS-DOS. When IBM's PC launched, it came preloaded with Microsoft's software. It was a partnership that would change everything. The machine sold millions, and with each sale, Microsoft's code reached another desk, another home, another dreamer's hands. In just a few years, Microsoft became the standard, the silent heartbeat behind the world's computers. But Bill wasn't satisfied. He saw something beyond text and code. He believed that computing should be visual, intuitive, almost human. He imagined a world where people didn't need to memorize commands. They could click, drag, and see their ideas take form on the screen. That vision became Windows. When Windows was first announced in 1983, many people doubted it. Critics said it was too slow, too complicated, too ambitious. Competitors like Apple already had graphical interfaces, and most thought Microsoft was too late to the game. But Bill was relentless. He believed that Windows wouldn't just be a product, it would be a platform, one that every computer maker could use and every user could understand. It took years of refinement, late nights, and countless revisions. Engineers worked around the clock, fueled by Bill's impossible standards. He would walk through the halls, challenging ideas, questioning every line of code. Some found his intensity exhausting. Others found it inspiring, but no one could deny that it worked. When Windows finally launched in 1985, it was far from perfect. Yet it represented something revolutionary, a window into a new kind of interaction between humans and machines. With each update, it improved, spreading quietly across the world. Within a decade, it would dominate the global market, turning Microsoft from a growing company into an empire. Through it all, Bill's focus never wavered. While competitors chased beauty or novelty, he chased universality, the dream of making computers accessible to everyone, everywhere. Windows wasn't just software, it was a philosophy, a belief that technology should empower, not intimidate. By the end of the 1980s, Microsoft had achieved what once seemed impossible. It wasn't just part of the industry. It was the industry. The boy who once sat alone at a school terminal had now built a digital kingdom powered not by hardware, but by vision. And still, deep down, he knew the journey was far from over. By the early 1990s, Bill Gates stood at the peak of success. Microsoft had become the undisputed leader of personal computing. Windows was everywhere, in schools, offices, and homes around the world. The digital age had arrived, and Bill was its architect. Yet even as he celebrated victory, a quiet storm was forming. A new technology was spreading through universities and labs. Something invisible, powerful, and unpredictable. It was called the Internet. At first, Bill didn't see it as a threat. He believed it was a passing trend, a hobbyist network for researchers and enthusiasts. Microsoft was focused on desktop computing, and business was booming. But slowly, the signs became impossible to ignore. Startups began to emerge with strange, new ideas: online stores, digital communication, and something called the World Wide Web. People were beginning to connect not just to their computers, but to each other. Inside Microsoft, a few young engineers tried to warn him. They told Bill that the Internet wasn't just another tool. It was the future. It would reshape everything: how people worked, learned, and shared information. At first, he resisted. He thought the idea of everyone being online sounded chaotic. But as months passed, the world began to change faster than even he could control. In 1994, he had what many call his moment of awakening. One day, while reviewing a demonstration of the web, Bill saw something that shifted his entire perspective. The Internet wasn't just a network. It was a new platform, one that could connect every computer on Earth. Suddenly, all his earlier visions of universal access, of personal computing for everyone, took on new meaning. This was the next frontier. He moved fast. Within months, Microsoft reorganized its entire strategy around the Internet. The company launched Internet Explorer, integrated online tools into Windows, and began investing heavily in web technologies. Critics called it desperate, but Bill saw it as survival. He once said, "The Internet is not a fad. It is the most important development since the personal computer." His decision wasn't just reactive. It was transformative. Microsoft's shift helped millions of people experience the web for the first time. Families who once used computers for work or games were now exploring the world through a browser window. Information was no longer trapped in books or offices. It was everywhere, waiting to be discovered. Yet, with this new age came new rivals. Companies like Netscape, Yahoo, and later Google began to challenge Microsoft's dominance. The competition grew fierce, even personal. The Internet was no longer just technology. It was territory. And Bill, now one of the world's most powerful men, found himself fighting to protect the empire he had built. But beyond the business wars, something had changed inside him. The Internet humbled him. It reminded him that no one could truly own innovation, that progress was a wave, not a wall. It reignited his curiosity, the same spark that once drew him to the terminal at Lakeside. The world had opened once again, and Bill Gates was ready to evolve with it. By the mid-1990s, Microsoft was not just a company. It was an empire. Windows powered more than 90% of the world's computers. Every home, every office, every digital heartbeat seemed to carry the name Microsoft. Yet power always invites challenge. The Internet had opened the floodgates of innovation, and now the company that once disrupted giants was being challenged by new ones. The fiercest of these battles began with a browser. Netscape Navigator, sleek and fast, was becoming the gateway to the web for millions of users. It wasn't just software. It was freedom from Microsoft's control. For the first time, someone else was defining how people experience the Internet. To Bill Gates, that was unacceptable. He believed that if Microsoft lost the browser war, it would lose the future itself. In response, he moved with precision. Microsoft released Internet Explorer, bundled it directly into Windows, and made it free. It was a strategic masterstroke, simple, but devastating. Within a few years, Netscape's market share collapsed. What had started as an innovation turned into a battle of ecosystems. The press called it aggressive. Competitors called it unfair. Bill called it survival. But victory came with a price. In 1998, the United States government filed a landmark antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft. The accusation was clear. The company had used its dominance to crush competition. Overnight, Bill Gates, once celebrated as a visionary, was portrayed as a monopolist. The hearings were long and public. His sharp intelligence, once admired, now came across as arrogance. It was a moment that tested not just his business, but his character. Behind the scenes, the toll was heavy. Employees felt the strain of scrutiny. Partners grew cautious. and Bill himself, for the first time, began to question the cost of absolute control. He had built Microsoft on the belief that efficiency and dominance could coexist with innovation. But the world was changing. The Internet had democratized power. The rules of technology were no longer his alone to write. The case dragged on for years, creating deep reflection within Microsoft's walls. Eventually, the company settled. It survived, wounded, but intact. And through that process, Bill Gates changed. The man who once lived for competition began to think more about cooperation, about legacy, and about what technology should mean beyond profit. He started to see that his real challenge wasn't another company or another product. It was time. The industry he helped create was evolving faster than ever, and he could no longer control every shift. The world had caught up to his vision. Now he had to decide what kind of leader he wanted to be in the age that followed. This was the turning point, not in Microsoft's story, but in Bill's own life. The boy who had once conquered machines now faced something far more human: the need to let go, to move from building power to building purpose. And in the quiet after the storm, he began to ask himself a question that would redefine everything that came next. What if the real revolution wasn't technological at all, but moral? When the dust from the courtroom battles began to settle, Bill Gates found himself standing at a crossroads. He had achieved everything that ambition could offer: wealth, influence, and control over an industry that had reshaped the world. Yet for the first time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar. It wasn't triumph, it was emptiness. The goals that had once driven him no longer felt enough. He began to notice the world beyond the boardroom, not as a market, but as a map of human struggle. News of disease, poverty, and inequality reached him in ways it never had before. Perhaps success had quieted the noise long enough for empathy to emerge. He started reading reports on global health, on malaria, on education, and what he discovered shocked him. Millions of children were dying from preventable diseases. Entire countries were falling behind, not because of a lack of intelligence, but a lack of opportunity. Bill realized that technology alone couldn't fix these problems, but perhaps the same mindset that built Microsoft could be used to solve them. Precision, data, systems, all the tools that powered software could also power change. And so, in 2000, he made a decision that would surprise the world. He stepped down as Microsoft's CEO and turned his focus toward something entirely new: the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It began quietly with a single goal: to improve global health and reduce poverty. But what started as philanthropy soon became a revolution in humanitarian work. The foundation applied the same analytical rigor that had once defined Microsoft. It measured results, tracked progress, and demanded accountability. Bill wasn't giving away money, he was building solutions. Through his foundation, billions were invested into vaccine research, education reform, and agricultural development. He met scientists, teachers, and leaders from around the world, people who worked not for profit, but for hope. These encounters changed him. For the first time, Bill saw the human side of progress, not just machines that process data, but lives that depend on compassion. In interviews, he often spoke with humility, something rare for a man once known for relentless competitiveness. He admitted that the business world had trained him to win, but philanthropy had taught him to listen. Success, he once said softly, is measured not by what you build, but by what you give. Those words carried the weight of a man who had spent decades mastering logic, only to rediscover the power of empathy. His partnership with Melinda became central to this new chapter. Together, they traveled the world, meeting families whose lives were being changed by the work of their foundation. For Bill, these moments were a new kind of feedback loop, not of code and numbers, but of gratitude and impact. It was a different kind of innovation, one that began with compassion instead of competition. As the 2000s unfolded, the foundation grew into one of the most influential charitable organizations in history. Its reach extended into every corner of the globe, fighting disease, funding schools, and empowering scientists. Bill had once dreamed of a computer on every desk. Now he dreamed of a future where every child could survive, learn, and thrive. This transformation wasn't a departure from who he was. It was a continuation. The same curiosity that once asked, "How can we make machines think?" had evolved into, "How can we make the world better?" The boy who once sought control had found meaning in letting go. And in this quiet, reflective chapter of his life, Bill Gates began to understand that the greatest legacy isn't built in code or contracts. It's built in compassion. It's written not in software, but in the hearts of those who live better because you existed. As the years passed, Bill Gates began to see the arc of his life not as a straight line, but as a series of evolving missions. From a curious child at a school terminal, to a relentless entrepreneur, to a philanthropist reshaping the future. Every phase had been driven by the same quiet force, the belief that ideas can change the world. By the 2010s, he was no longer just the man who built Microsoft. He had become a global figure, part innovator, part humanitarian, part philosopher. His name was now spoken not only in boardrooms, but in classrooms and clinics around the world. He had moved beyond technology into something deeper, legacy. What made Bill's story remarkable wasn't just the scale of his success, but the transformation of his purpose. Few people in history have climbed to such heights, only to look down and decide that helping others climb mattered more. In his speeches, his tone softened. The sharp edge of competition was replaced with calm reflection. He spoke not of dominance, but of duty, of how intelligence must be paired with empathy, and how power means little if it serves only itself. Through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he continued to focus on global health, vaccines, and education. Yet behind the statistics and headlines was something profoundly human. In villages across Africa and Asia, children were surviving diseases that once seemed unstoppable. Schools were rising where none existed before. For families who had never heard of Microsoft, the name Gates meant something entirely different. It meant hope. He often said that innovation without compassion is incomplete, that the same creativity that drives progress must also drive humanity forward. It was a philosophy born not from wealth, but from awareness, the understanding that true success is not measured by what you own, but by what remains when you're gone. In private moments, friends and colleagues described him as reflective, even spiritual in his thinking. He no longer chased the future as he once did. Instead, he studied it through the lens of climate change, pandemics, and education. His focus turned toward the survival of our planet, the shared home that connects us all. It was no longer about computers in every home, but about hope in every heart. Bill's journey reminds us that greatness isn't about being first, fastest, or richest. It's about seeing farther, about using intellect not to dominate, but to elevate. The same intensity that once built Microsoft now built bridges between science and compassion, data and dignity. He had evolved from a builder of code to a builder of humanity's future. Looking back, the story of Bill Gates is not just about technology. It's about transformation, about a man who learned that the mind can change the world, but only the heart can heal it. His legacy isn't stored in servers or systems. It lives quietly in the millions of lives touched by his work. And as he once said, with a faint smile that carried both humility and hope, the real measure of progress is not how much we advance ourselves, but how much we advance each other. As Microsoft reached heights few could imagine, Bill Gates began to feel the invisible weight, that comes with being at the center of the digital revolution. The company had grown from two young dreamers writing code into a vast empire that powered the world's computers. But with every innovation came expectation, and with every success came a new layer of scrutiny. Greatness, he discovered, was not freedom, it was responsibility. Bill's days were filled with endless meetings, product reviews, and debates over the future of technology. The world saw him as untouchable, a billionaire genius who had reshaped human progress. Yet behind the glass walls of Redmond, he often stayed late into the night, still reading code, still asking questions, still unsatisfied. Perfection had built Microsoft, but it also haunted him. He expected from others what he demanded from himself with everything. This intensity became both his greatest strength and his quiet torment. Employees admired his brilliance, but feared his precision. He could spot a single flaw in a sea of success, a misplaced line in 1,000 perfect ones. Gates once said that the hardest part of leadership is realizing that you cannot do it all, that even the sharpest mind must learn to trust others. But trust did not come easily to him. Every product, every release, every decision carried his signature. By the mid-1990s, the pressure began to shift. The world outside Microsoft was changing faster than ever. The Internet was rising, competitors were growing bolder, and governments were beginning to question the dominance of his company. What had started as a dream of empowerment was now seen by some as control. The man who wanted computers for everyone was being painted as a monopolist. It was a strange irony. The visionary who opened the digital world now stood accused of closing it. Privately, Bill wrestled with this image. He never saw himself as the villain that the media sometimes portrayed. To him, Microsoft was simply doing what innovators always did, pushing forward. But he also began to understand that power, no matter how well-intentioned, changes perception. Innovation invites resistance, and leadership demands humility. For the first time, Bill had to face not a technical problem, but a human one: reputation. At night, he would sometimes walk alone through the quiet halls of Microsoft's campus. He'd look at the glowing monitors and think about how far they had come from that small Albuquerque office. He knew they were building history, but history was never kind and never simple. It praised, it questioned, and it always demanded more. In those moments, he reflected on the paradox of success, that the higher one climbs, the thinner the air becomes. The vision that once united everyone now divided opinion. The empire that empowered millions also trapped him within expectations no one could meet. And yet, even under pressure, his drive did not fade. The boy who loved logic was still there, searching for patterns, trying to understand the world's most complex system: human nature. Bill Gates had conquered the digital frontier, but in doing so he discovered a truth that every great innovator eventually learns, that the burden of greatness is not measured by how much you achieve, but by how deeply you care about what happens after. By the late 1990s, the winds had shifted. What began as whispers of concern became a thunderous wave of investigation. Governments, journalists, and competitors all turned their gaze toward Microsoft. They claimed the company had become too powerful, too dominant, too willing to crush anyone who stood in its way. Bill Gates, once the young idealist who dreamed of putting a computer in every home, was now being painted as the architect of a digital monopoly. The U.S. Department of Justice filed its case. The charge was clear. Microsoft had used its position to control the market, forcing others to bend or break under its reach. For Bill, it was not just a legal battle. It was a test of everything he believed in. He saw the company's actions as the natural evolution of innovation, pushing forward, improving, expanding. But the world was now looking for limits, not leadership. The courtroom became a stage. Lawyers dissected lines of code, internal emails, and strategic decisions. Every move was analyzed, every quote magnified. Bill sat through depositions and hearings, answering questions that often cut deeper than any technical challenge he had faced. His usual calm precision turned defensive, even combative at times. For the first time, the man who had built an empire through intellect found himself trapped in a system he could not outthink. Outside, the media fed on the spectacle. Headlines called him arrogant, ruthless, even dangerous. Cartoons portrayed him as a digital emperor ruling from his Windows throne. For the public, it was a rare glimpse behind the curtain of a company that seemed invincible. And for Bill, it was a lesson in perception, that success, when misunderstood, can look like tyranny. In private, he struggled with the weight of it all. Friends noticed a change, less laughter, fewer jokes, and a growing weariness behind his trademark glasses. It wasn't the loss of reputation that bothered him most. It was the realization that his dream had somehow been twisted. The idea of empowering the world through software had become entangled with power itself. The mission had not changed, but the narrative around it had. The antitrust trial dragged on for years. Microsoft faced billions in potential fines, and its culture was shaken. Employees who once saw themselves as revolutionaries began to question their leader. Bill knew that no matter how the case ended, something fundamental would break. The purity of the dream that started it all. When the verdict finally came, the ruling was complex but clear enough. Microsoft had gone too far. The company would survive, but not without scars. Gates stepped down as CEO in 2000, handing the reins to Steve Ballmer. Officially, it was time for a new chapter, but emotionally, it felt like the end of an era. The end of the dreamer who once stayed up all night writing code, replaced by the man who now had to live with consequences far larger than any program. And yet, even in the storm's aftermath, Bill did not retreat. He watched the company he built transform under pressure, evolve under scrutiny. The experience humbled him, but it also freed him. For the first time in decades, he could think beyond the walls of Microsoft, beyond profits, beyond markets, towards something deeper. The antitrust storm had shaken his empire, but it also cleared his vision. The same man who once fought for dominance now began to fight for understanding. The question that lingered was no longer, what can I build next, but what can I build that truly matters? When the dust of the antitrust storm finally settled, Bill Gates found himself standing in unfamiliar silence. For decades, his life had been a blur of code, competition, and creation. Every moment was measured by progress, every decision aimed at building something bigger. But now the noise had faded. The meetings, the lawsuits, the headlines, all gave way to a new, quieter question. What happens when you step away from the empire you built? Letting go did not come easily to Bill. Microsoft had been his identity, his purpose, and his reflection. To watch someone else take the helm felt like watching a part of himself drift into history. Yet he knew that clinging too tightly to control would only hold the company back. He had always believed in evolution, that systems, like people, must change to survive. And so he began the slow, deliberate process of detaching from the day-to-day life of the company that defined him. In 2000, Steve Ballmer officially became CEO, and Bill took on a new role as Chief Software Architect. It was a compromise between departure and presence, a way to stay connected while preparing for the next chapter. But in truth, he was already thinking beyond technology. The trial had left him reflective, even restless. He began to see that his true legacy might not lie in operating systems or software, but in something far greater, the impact he could make on human lives. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to pause, to breathe, to look beyond the blue glow of screens and into the world outside. The simplicity of ordinary life fascinated him, a world not measured by lines of code but by moments of meaning. Friends recalled how his conversations shifted from products and patents to poverty and public health. Something within him was changing. The same analytical mind that once obsessed over algorithms now sought to understand inequality, disease, and education. But even as he tried to move forward, letting go was still a daily lesson. Old habits lingered, checking updates, offering feedback, diving deep into projects that were no longer his responsibility. Microsoft was like gravity, always pulling him back. Yet each time he resisted that pull, he grew lighter. He began spending more time with Melinda, exploring what they could do together beyond the business world. The seeds of a new mission, one that had been quietly forming for years, were finally beginning to take root. It was during these years that Bill started to realize something profound about success. That true achievement is not about holding on to what you've built, but knowing when to let it evolve without you. Leadership, he learned, is not a permanent throne. It is a torch meant to be passed forward so that others may light the way. He was still young, still wealthy beyond imagination, but he no longer chased the same kind of victory. Instead, he searched for purpose. What good was a mind that could reshape technology if it couldn't also reshape lives? The answer came slowly, quietly, in conversations with doctors, scientists, and educators. They spoke of problems the world had ignored for too long: malaria, polio, illiteracy, and hunger. Bill listened, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't think about profit or competition. He thought about people. The boy who once dreamed of changing the world through computers was beginning to dream again, this time through compassion. He had built the world's most powerful software company. Now he wanted to build something even greater, a legacy of hope. When Bill Gates stepped further away from Microsoft, he entered a world he had long observed but rarely touched. For decades, his focus had been binary: problems to solve, systems to perfect, goals to meet. But now, the problems were human, not technical. They were complex, unpredictable, and deeply emotional. And yet, that same part of him, the relentless mind that sought order in chaos, felt drawn to them. This was no longer about building machines. It was about rebuilding hope. Bill and Melinda had always talked about doing something meaningful with their fortune. The question was never if, but how. In 2000, they formalized their vision into what would become one of the most influential philanthropic organizations in history, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Its mission was simple yet profound: to give every person the chance to live a healthy, productive life. Behind that mission was an unshakable belief that intelligence and resources must serve humanity, not just innovation. The foundation began by targeting the challenges most of the world ignored: diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, and polio. Bill was shocked by how preventable these illnesses were, and how millions still died from them simply because of poverty or geography. It reminded him of how software once belonged only to the elite, until he made it accessible. Now he wanted to make life itself more accessible: health, education, and opportunity for all. He approached philanthropy the same way he once approached code, with precision, research, and relentless iteration. He read medical journals, met with scientists, and traveled to remote parts of Africa and Asia. Instead of engineers, his meetings were now filled with doctors and development experts. Each time he visited a rural clinic or spoke with a mother who had lost a child to disease, the work became personal. He saw what inequality looked like, not as a chart or report, but as human faces. There was a deep humility in this transformation. The man who once competed with global giants was now battling invisible enemies: viruses, ignorance, and indifference. He wasn't chasing profit or market share. He was chasing progress. And yet, the spirit that defined Microsoft, the hunger to solve, to scale, to innovate, never left him. He applied it to vaccines, sanitation, and education, bringing the same intensity that once built software to building solutions for humanity. Some critics doubted his motives, claiming it was just another kind of control. A billionaire rewriting global policy through money, but Bill understood that criticism was the shadow of action. He welcomed the debate because it meant people were finally paying attention to problems too long ignored. He often said, "If you want to change the world, you have to be ready to be misunderstood." As the foundation grew, so did his conviction that technology and humanity were not opposites. They were partners. Every innovation could become a tool for compassion, every breakthrough a bridge to equality. In this belief, the once fiercely competitive coder found peace. His legacy no longer lived only in software updates or business milestones, but in lives changed quietly, far from the spotlight. By the end of the decade, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had become the largest private philanthropic organization in the world. But for Bill, it was still deeply personal. Each time he saw a child vaccinated, a student receiving education, or a disease brought closer to extinction, he felt the same spark he once felt staring at a glowing computer screen, the feeling that the world could indeed be changed by human thought and determination. Bill Gates had started his journey wanting to give the world access to technology. Now, he wanted to give it access to a better life. It was the same dream, only matured, a dream not written in code, but in compassion. As the years passed, the world began to see Bill Gates through a different lens. The fierce, analytical CEO who once dominated the technology world was now the quiet, reflective philanthropist devoting his time to solving humanity's deepest problems. The transformation was striking, not because of the wealth he gave away, but because of the humility with which he gave it. He had spent decades building machines that empowered people. Now he was working to empower the people themselves. Bill's days were no longer filled with software updates and product launches. Instead, his calendar was filled with global health briefings, field visits, and discussions about vaccine distribution, sanitation, and education. He immersed himself in data, not of market share or sales, but of lives saved, diseases reduced, and communities lifted out of despair. The same intensity that once defined his business life now fueled his humanitarian one. But this new chapter was not about reinvention. It was about redemption. Bill had always believed in the power of human intellect, but now he saw the deeper power of empathy. He came to understand that true intelligence is not just the ability to solve problems, but the willingness to feel them. Every statistic in his reports represented a life, a family, a story. That realization changed the way he viewed progress. It was no longer about speed or scale, but about meaning. Many people wondered how a man who once symbolized the rise of corporate power could now become a voice for compassion. But perhaps it was inevitable. For all his competitive spirit, Bill Gates had always been guided by curiosity, the need to understand, to fix, to improve. And when he turned that curiosity toward humanity, the results were just as transformative as his software. He once optimized operating systems for computers. Now he was trying to optimize the systems that sustain life. Still, the transition was not without its critics. Some accused him of being out of touch, claiming that his wealth gave him too much influence over global health and policy. Others questioned his right to decide which causes deserved attention. Bill listened, as he always had, and then quietly continued his work. His answer to criticism was progress, measured not in applause, but in outcomes. He believed that if the mission was right, understanding would follow. One of the most striking things about Bill in this era was his calmness. The urgency that once drove him to outwork competitors had been replaced by patience, the understanding that the world's biggest problems cannot be solved overnight. He had shifted from the speed of business to the pace of change, from the rush of innovation to the rhythm of healing. He began to spend more time studying the intersection of technology and humanity, artificial intelligence, climate change, and global sustainability. He saw the same opportunities for innovation that he once found in the early days of Microsoft, only now the stakes were much higher. The future was no longer a market to capture. It was a planet to protect. In interviews, Bill often spoke softly, his tone thoughtful and measured. He didn't speak like a billionaire or a mogul, but like a teacher, explaining, guiding, and reflecting. The same boy who once stayed up all night learning to program was now staying up late, thinking about how to prevent the next pandemic or provide clean energy to the developing world. His drive had not changed, only his direction. And perhaps that is what makes Bill Gates so fascinating. He is a man who has lived two lives within one lifetime, the builder and the benefactor, the coder and the caretaker. He mastered machines, then learned to master compassion. He changed the world once through innovation, and then again through kindness. In the end, the measure of his greatness was not the size of his company or the wealth he accumulated, but the depth of his conscience. The world had known many billionaires, but few who carried such a sense of responsibility. Bill Gates had become something rare, a mind that changed the future and a heart that refused to forget the present. Long before Microsoft became a household name, before the lawsuits and the fame, there were two boys who simply loved machines, Bill Gates and Paul Allen. Two friends connected by curiosity, competition, and a shared fascination with the mysterious world of code. They spent their youth lost in logic, solving problems for fun, driven by the quiet thrill of making a computer obey their will. What began as a friendship in a small computer room in Seattle would grow into one of the most influential partnerships in modern history. But as Microsoft rose, so did the distance between them. The company's rapid success demanded everything: time, energy, and a relentless commitment to perfection. Bill's intensity sometimes clashed with Paul's quiet creativity. They were bound by the same dream, but carried different temperaments. When Paul was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma in the early 1980s, the cracks began to show. Facing mortality, he saw life differently. Bill, still consumed by the mission, struggled to slow down. Eventually, Paul left Microsoft. The separation was painful but inevitable. They had built something extraordinary together, but their paths were no longer aligned. Bill continued to lead the company through expansion and innovation, while Paul pursued new ventures, exploring music, sports, and space technology. To the world, it seemed like their friendship had ended, another casualty of ambition. But beneath the surface, the connection remained, unspoken yet unbroken. Years later, after the chaos of Microsoft's peak and the antitrust battles, Bill began to reflect more deeply on his past. In those quiet moments, he often thought about Paul, the boy who had believed in him before anyone else did, the friend who shared his vision when it was nothing more than a dream between two teenagers. Bill knew that without Paul, there would have been no Microsoft, no revolution in personal computing, and perhaps no Bill Gates as we know him today. They reconnected over the years, exchanging letters, memories, and mutual respect. When Paul passed away in 2018, Bill wrote a heartfelt tribute. It wasn't the message of a business partner, it was the voice of a lifelong friend. He spoke not of technology or achievement, but of shared wonder, of two kids who saw potential in blinking lights and endless code. He thanked Paul for his insight, his patience, and his friendship that had helped shape the very foundation of his life. In that moment, Bill's words revealed something deeper about his journey. For all the success, all the impact, and all the transformation, what remained most meaningful were the human connections forged along the way. The story of Microsoft was not just the story of innovation, it was the story of trust, belief, and friendship. Bill often said that Paul was the spark that started it all, the quiet genius beside him, the steady mind that balanced his restless ambition. And though their lives had diverged, that spark never truly faded. It lived on in every piece of technology that connected people, every program that empowered a new generation of thinkers. In remembering Paul, Bill seemed to rediscover a piece of himself, the part that once dreamed freely, unburdened by expectation. The friendship that began in a high school computer lab had endured through time, success, and loss. It was proof that even in a world built on logic, the most powerful code is still written in the heart. When the noise of achievement fades and the lights of success dim, what remains is the question that every great life eventually faces. What was it all for? For Bill Gates, the answer has evolved over decades, from ambition to creation to understanding. His story is not merely one of innovation or fortune, it's a quiet exploration of how power, knowledge, and purpose can coexist in one human being. In his youth, Bill's world revolved around logic. He saw life as a system, a set of problems waiting to be solved with precision and intellect. But over time, the code of his life began to shift. The more he built, the more he realized that technology alone could not solve the deeper problems of humanity. Computers could make life faster, but not always better. Data could inform decisions, but not replace empathy. It was a revelation that came not from algorithms, but from experience, from watching the world beyond Microsoft's walls. As he transitioned from CEO to philanthropist, Bill's vision expanded. Through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he began tackling challenges that had no simple solutions: poverty, disease, education. These were not bugs in a system. They were the struggles of human existence. And this time, there was no code to debug, only compassion to apply. He learned that real impact isn't about dominance, but service. The same determination that once built an empire was now directed toward building hope. In reflection, Bill often admits he was not always easy to work with. His intensity sometimes blinded him to the people behind the process. But wisdom, like software, is updated over time. He grew to see that leadership is not about control, it's about empowerment. He learned to listen more, to mentor, and to guide rather than command. In this evolution lies perhaps the most valuable lesson of his life. Intelligence creates success, but humility sustains it. The story of Bill Gates teaches us that greatness is rarely linear. It is a series of iterations, versions of the self, each one a little wiser, a little more complete. His journey reminds us that innovation without purpose is hollow, and that real genius lies not in what we can build, but in how we use what we build to uplift others. When we look at Bill now, we see not just the architect of Microsoft, but a man who learned to navigate the space between logic and empathy. The restless boy who once stayed up nights debugging code now spends his days debugging the world, seeking ways to fix what is broken, not in machines, but in humanity. And perhaps that is the quiet beauty of his legacy. It is not just about Windows or the personal computer or the foundation that bears his name. It is about transformation, about the courage to keep evolving even after you've reached the summit. Bill's life reminds us that no matter how far technology advances, the deepest progress will always begin within ourselves. In the end, Bill Gates' story is not one of perfection, but of perspective. From a boy who loved logic to a man who learned compassion, his journey mirrors our own, a reminder that intelligence can shape the world, but kindness sustains it. He showed us that even the greatest coders must one day look beyond the screen and ask, what kind of world am I helping to create? And in that question, quiet, timeless, and human, lies the true legacy of Bill Gates. Every empire, no matter how great, eventually meets resistance. For Microsoft, the 1990s were both a golden age and a battlefield. Bill Gates had built a company so powerful, so integrated into the digital fabric of the world, that it inevitably drew rivals and critics. What began as innovation soon transformed into a struggle for dominance, and the dominance came with consequences. As Windows became the world's default operating system, competitors accused Microsoft of using its power unfairly. Smaller software developers struggled to survive under the shadow of this giant. Tech companies that once admired Microsoft began to see it as an obstacle. The once bright, boyish image of Bill Gates, the young visionary who dreamed of computers for everyone, started to shift. The press began painting him not as a creator, but as a monopolist. Inside Microsoft, the pressure was relentless. Gates was known for his fiery meetings, intense, precise, and often intimidating. He questioned every assumption, tore apart weak arguments, and demanded perfection. To his engineers, he was both mentor and storm. But beneath the sharp exterior was a deep fear, the fear that innovation would slow, that Microsoft would lose the creative edge that made it great. In a world moving faster each year, that fear was valid. The controversies surrounding Microsoft began to pile up. Antitrust lawsuits loomed. Governments questioned whether Gates had built not just a company, but a fortress, one that controlled too much of the future. Competitors like Netscape, Apple, and later Google were gaining momentum, chipping away at Microsoft's once unchallenged reign. The public watched as the world's richest man became the face of corporate greed, his every move scrutinized. But even in conflict, there was clarity. Gates saw competition as the heartbeat of progress. To him, rivals were not enemies but motivators, challenges that forced innovation. He once said, "Success is a lousy teacher. It seduces smart people into thinking they can't lose." Those words, spoken during Microsoft's height, would later echo with haunting truth. The controversy taught him humility. It reminded him that even the most brilliant systems can falter when they forget their purpose. Microsoft was never meant to dominate. It was meant to empower. Somewhere along the way, that vision blurred. And for the first time, Bill Gates began to question whether the company he had built was still serving the dream that inspired it. Yet, in typical Gates fashion, he did not retreat. He confronted the criticism head-on, balancing legal battles by day and product development by night. While lawyers debated in courtrooms, engineers under his leadership continued to build, refining Windows, improving Office, and preparing for a new age of computing that was already on the horizon. It was a stormy chapter, but it was also a turning point. The fire of competition tempered Bill's vision. It burned away arrogance and left something purer behind: perspective. He began to see that leadership was not just about winning, but about responsibility, that in creating the tools of the future, one must also protect the freedom that makes innovation possible. The controversies that once threatened to tarnish his name instead became the crucible that reshaped him. For Bill Gates, it was not the end of an era, but the beginning of reflection, a moment when the world's most logical mind began to understand the weight of power and the cost of brilliance. By the late 1990s, the world no longer saw Bill Gates as just a brilliant innovator. He had become the symbol of dominance in the tech world, a man whose company seemed to control the very foundation of modern computing. But with great power came suspicion. Governments, journalists, and rivals began asking the same question. Had Microsoft become too powerful? The storm began quietly, with whispers of unfair competition. Microsoft's Windows operating system was everywhere, in homes, offices, schools, and governments. It was the digital backbone of the new millennium. But when the company began bundling its Internet Explorer browser with Windows, competitors like Netscape cried foul. They argued that Microsoft was using its monopoly to crush any rival that dared to challenge it. Soon those whispers turned into lawsuits, and lawsuits became headlines. In 1998, the U.S. Department of Justice took Microsoft to court in one of the largest antitrust cases in history. The image of Bill Gates, once the young dreamer who wrote code in his dorm room, was now replaced by a stern CEO sitting in depositions, his every word analyzed. The trial painted Microsoft as an empire that had forgotten its humble origins. The government argued that Gates had built a digital kingdom, and that kingdom needed to be broken apart. For Bill, it was a personal and professional reckoning. He had always believed that success came from building the best product, from outthinking rather than outmaneuvering competitors. But now he was portrayed as the very thing he once stood against, the gatekeeper of innovation. His video testimony during the trial became infamous. The confident genius appeared tense, defensive, even arrogant. The press was ruthless, and public opinion began to turn. Inside Microsoft, morale wavered. Engineers who once idolized Gates now watched as their leader battled governments instead of building software. Meetings became heavier, the mood more uncertain. The company that had always moved fast and fearlessly now found itself trapped in legal limbo. Every new project was weighed against what might provoke the regulators further. The creativity that once defined Microsoft began to slow. Yet even in the heart of the storm, Gates never stopped thinking. He studied the case, analyzed every angle, and prepared for a long fight. To him, this wasn't just about Microsoft. It was about the future of innovation itself. If the government could dictate how technology evolved, then the spirit of invention could be at risk. He saw himself as defending not just a company, but an idea, that bold thinking should not be punished for succeeding. But deep down, he also began to see the other side. The trial forced him to reflect on how Microsoft's power had changed him, how the relentless pursuit of dominance had made him blind to how others saw the world. It was a humbling realization for a man who had once believed that logic could solve everything. The antitrust case was not just a battle of law, it was a lesson in perception, power, and responsibility. When the verdict came, it was mixed. Microsoft was found guilty of violating antitrust laws, and for a time, there was talk of splitting the company in two. But after years of appeals, negotiations, and settlements, Microsoft survived intact. The empire endured, shaken but not shattered. For Gates, however, something fundamental had changed. He began to step back, to think beyond competition. The storm had revealed a truth that no court could define, that real leadership isn't about control, it's about legacy. He started to imagine a world where his influence could extend beyond technology toward something more meaningful. The antitrust storm had taken its toll, but it also cleared the air. It stripped away illusion and left behind clarity. Bill Gates emerged from it not just as a CEO, but as a man learning to see the world in a new way, not through the lens of dominance, but through the eyes of responsibility. The storm had passed, but the man who walked out of it would never be the same. When the antitrust trial ended, Bill Gates found himself standing in a strange new light, not as the visionary who revolutionized computing, but as the public enemy of innovation. Newspapers, journalists, and talk shows painted him as the villain of Silicon Valley. The once admired genius was now the face of corporate greed, accused of strangling creativity and crushing competition beneath the weight of Microsoft's power. The transformation was jarring. For years, Bill had been seen as the symbol of progress, the man who dreamed of putting a computer on every desk and in every home. But success had changed perception. The more his company grew, the more the world grew suspicious of it. Rivals like Apple and Google began positioning themselves as the rebels, the underdogs fighting against the Microsoft machine. Gates, for all his brilliance, had become the establishment, the system everyone wanted to break. Public perception is a powerful force, and it hit him harder than any courtroom defeat. For the first time, he began to understand how it felt to be feared rather than admired. Critics accused him of stifling innovation, of using his influence to dominate markets, and dictate the direction of technology. He read the headlines, heard the accusations, and quietly wondered, had I become the very thing I once wanted to challenge? Inside Microsoft, the mood was equally conflicted. Some employees defended him fiercely, believing he was a victim of success, punished for being too good at what he did. Others felt the company had lost its soul, becoming too focused on market share and too distant from the joy of creation. The culture that once thrived on curiosity now carried the weight of corporate caution. It was no longer a playground of ideas. It was a battlefield of expectations. And through it all, Bill kept working. He still reviewed code, still debated product strategy late into the night, still obsessed over every detail. But something was shifting inside him. The endless race to dominate no longer felt fulfilling. The world saw him as the enemy of innovation, but in his mind, he was still the same kid from Lakeside, the boy who loved to solve problems, not create them. Somewhere between that boy and the billionaire, the meaning of his mission had gotten lost. There were moments of solitude where Gates began to reflect, not as a CEO, but as a human being. He saw the irony. The same world that accused him of stifling progress had been built on the technology his company made possible. Every programmer, every startup, every creative mind using a PC or Windows was in some way part of the world he helped create. But perception doesn't deal in logic. It deals in feeling. And emotionally, the world was ready for a new hero, someone not named Bill Gates. Yet, history has a way of rewriting itself. In time, many of those who once called him the enemy would come to see the larger picture. They would realize that Microsoft's dominance also brought standardization, accessibility, and opportunity. But that realization would come later. For now, the story was simple. The genius who built the digital world had become the man who controlled it. It was a lonely place to stand. But in that loneliness, something profound began to take root, a seed of transformation. Bill began to see that his greatest contribution might not come from fighting for innovation, but from enabling it in new ways. The public had turned him into a symbol, but he was ready to rewrite the symbol's meaning. He could not change how people saw him, at least not yet. But he could change what he did next. And that quiet decision, made not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but deep within his own conscience, would mark the beginning of a new chapter. The man once called the enemy of innovation was about to discover what it truly meant to innovate. Not with code, but with compassion. By the early 2000s, Bill Gates had become both a legend and a cautionary tale. He was the man who built the digital age, and the man accused of controlling it. But behind the headlines and the legal battles, a quieter story was unfolding. A man once driven by pure logic was beginning to see the limits of the very system he had created. For decades, Microsoft's mission had been clear: to put a computer on every desk and in every home. And in many ways, that dream had come true. But success, as Bill discovered, carries its own kind of failure. The more the world depended on Microsoft, the more rigid it became. Innovation slowed. Bureaucracy grew. Creativity, once the company's heartbeat, began to fade under the weight of its own dominance. Bill could feel it. Meetings became longer, ideas more cautious. Decisions were debated endlessly by layers of management that didn't exist when the company was young. Microsoft was no longer the scrappy underdog. It was the establishment. The rebel had become the ruler. And for a man who had once thrived on disruption, that realization was unsettling. So, Bill began to question everything. He looked around the company he built and wondered whether it still reflected his original vision. The tools were more powerful than ever, but the passion felt smaller. He saw talented engineers buried under corporate rules, creativity replaced by compliance. Somewhere along the way, Microsoft had stopped fighting the system and had become it. And so, in a way, Bill began fighting his own creation. He pushed back against the very machine he had built, challenging teams to take risks again, to rediscover the spark that had once made them fearless. He encouraged innovation even when it meant cannibalizing their own products. He reminded his engineers that the company's purpose wasn't to maintain control, it was to empower the world. But fighting a system you built is never easy. The habits of success are hard to break. Many within Microsoft were comfortable, even complacent. They had achieved everything they once dreamed of. Why risk it all now? Bill's insistence on change felt to some like an echo of the past, a younger man's energy trapped in an empire that had grown old. Outside the company, new challengers were emerging. Apple was reinventing itself under Steve Jobs. Google was rewriting the Internet. The world was shifting from desktop to web, from control to connectivity. And for the first time, Microsoft wasn't leading the revolution. It was watching from behind. That reality shook Bill deeply. He knew the future would not wait for him. To survive, Microsoft needed to evolve, and so did he. But transformation required more than technical innovation. It demanded a new mindset, a willingness to question not just products, but power itself. Bill began speaking more about ethics, about access, about responsibility. The once fierce competitor was slowly becoming something else, a guardian of what technology could mean for humanity. There was irony in it all. The man once accused of dominating the digital world was now fighting to make that world freer, more open, and more fair. He had built the system, but now he wanted to make sure it served everyone, not just those who built it. And perhaps that was the truest sign of growth. To create something great is one kind of genius, but to confront its flaws, to admit it can do better, is another. Bill Gates was no longer just a coder or a CEO. He was a man learning to balance the precision of machines with the imperfection of humanity. He had fought competitors, governments, and critics, but now he faced his most important battle of all, fighting the system he helped create, not to destroy it, but to make it kinder, wiser, and more human. For most of his life, Bill Gates had been defined by control over his company, his ideas, and the pace of the technological revolution itself. Every product, every decision, every line of strategy once passed through his sharp, analytical mind. It was how Microsoft thrived, under the precise, relentless leadership of a man who refused to accept imperfection. But by the early 2000s, the world around him was shifting faster than even he could manage. And for the first time, Bill began to realize that real leadership might mean something very different from control. Letting go was not in his nature. He had built Microsoft from a vision in his head, carried it through chaos, and guarded it like a part of himself. To separate from it felt almost like losing a piece of his identity. But the signs were everywhere. New technologies were emerging that he hadn't built. The Internet was changing how people used software. Competitors were innovating in ways that required a new kind of thinking, one that came from collaboration, not domination. Bill began to feel the weight of his own legacy. The company was enormous now. Tens of thousands of employees, billions in revenue, products spanning every corner of the digital world. But the young man who once wrote code all night was now buried under layers of meetings, policies, and global complexity. He could no longer do what he loved most, building things from nothing. The company had grown beyond even its creator's hands. So he made a decision that few in his position ever find the courage to make. Bill Gates chose to step back, not because he had to, but because he needed to. He wanted to think bigger, beyond software, beyond business, beyond Microsoft itself. It wasn't an end. It was a transition. A new kind of challenge, one that would demand not his intellect, but his humility. In 2000, he handed over the CEO role to Steve Ballmer, his longtime friend and partner in the journey. For Bill, it was an emotional moment, one of pride and of loss. He would stay on as chairman and chief software architect, But the rhythm of his life would change. The intensity of daily leadership would slowly give way to something more reflective. He began to spend more time thinking about global issues: disease, education, poverty, problems that could not be solved with code alone. It wasn't an easy transition. There were moments of doubt, moments when he questioned if stepping back was the right choice. He watched as others took the reins of the company he had built from nothing, and sometimes felt the instinct to return, to fix, to lead again. But each time he reminded himself, letting go is not the same as walking away. It is trusting that what you've built can stand on its own. And Microsoft did. It evolved, struggled, adapted, and grew in new directions. Some choices made under others' leadership Bill disagreed with, but he also understood something profound. Every creation must outgrow its creator. True success isn't about control. It's about legacy. In those early years of stepping back, Gates began to experience something he had never allowed himself before: stillness. He had time to think, to read, to explore the world beyond business. And in that quiet, he rediscovered curiosity, the same force that had started his journey decades ago. But now, curiosity had a new target: not machines, but humanity. Bill Gates, the programmer who once changed the way the world worked, was learning to change the way he himself lived. He was discovering that power means little if it cannot be used to lift others, that knowledge means nothing if it cannot ease suffering, and that to truly lead, one must first learn how to let go. This chapter marked not the end of his influence, but the beginning of his transformation. The man who once dreamed of putting a computer on every desk was about to dream even bigger, of giving opportunity to every life. As Bill Gates slowly stepped back from his daily role, Microsoft began to transform, not only in what it built, but in who it was. The company that once embodied the fierce energy of its founder was entering a new era, one of reinvention and rediscovery. The rhythm of the organization shifted from the pulse of a startup to the measured stride of a global institution. For the first time in decades, the face of Microsoft was no longer Bill Gates, and that change would test everything the company stood for. Steve Ballmer, Bill's longtime friend and successor, brought his own brand of leadership: louder, bolder, more aggressive. Where Bill was precise and analytical, Ballmer was emotional and relentless. The two had built Microsoft together, but now their paths were diverging. Bill moved toward global philanthropy, while Ballmer focused on running and expanding the company's core empire. It was a natural evolution, but also a quiet farewell to an era. The world, too, was changing. The Internet was no longer a novelty. It was the center of everything. Companies like Google and Apple were rewriting the rules of technology. Smartphones were rising, cloud computing was emerging, and the software that once lived on desktops was moving into the invisible world of servers and data. Microsoft, built on selling boxed software, now faced a future where physical products meant little. To survive, it needed to adapt fast. Inside the company, some struggled with this new reality. The culture Bill had built, one of intense precision and endless debate, was both strength and a burden. It encouraged excellence, but sometimes slowed innovation. Younger engineers, inspired by the energy of new startups, began to see Microsoft as the old guard, a relic of the PC age. The company's once rebellious soul was in danger of becoming cautious and corporate. Bill watched this transformation from a distance. He was no longer in every meeting, no longer the first to challenge every idea. But Microsoft was still his child, and he couldn't help but care deeply. When the company stumbled, as it sometimes did, he felt it like a personal wound. Yet, he also understood that growth meant independence. The company had to find its own way, even if that meant making mistakes. There were triumphs and missteps. Windows XP became one of the most beloved versions of Microsoft's operating system, while the failure of Windows Vista reminded the world that even giants can falter. Competitors gained ground. Apple rose to dominate with its sleek design and emotional storytelling. Google conquered the web. Microsoft was powerful, but not invincible. And that realization humbled the company and its founder. Still, there was something enduring in Microsoft's DNA that refused to fade: resilience. The company learned, evolved, and continued to shape the world quietly, behind the scenes. Its products became tools for builders, creators, and dreamers everywhere. Even as others captured the spotlight, Microsoft's presence remained constant, a reminder that the roots of modern technology still traced back to one man's vision of empowering people through code. For Bill Gates, watching Microsoft change was bittersweet. He no longer saw himself in every decision, but he saw his values, curiosity, precision, and belief in human potential, still alive in the culture. The company he had built no longer needed him in the same way, and that, he realized, was the truest measure of success. The face of Microsoft was changing. Its mission was evolving, but its foundation, the idea that technology could change lives, remained untouched. Bill's dream had grown far beyond him. It was no longer just about Windows or software. It was about possibility itself. And as the company marched into a new century, Bill Gates, now stepping further into philanthropy, watched from the sidelines with a quiet sense of peace. He had built the tools of a digital world. Now he was ready to help build something even greater, a better world for those who used them. As the new millennium unfolded, a quiet revolution swept across the world, one that even Bill Gates, with all his foresight, hadn't fully predicted. The rise of the Internet changed everything. It rewrote the rules of business, communication, and knowledge itself. It was no longer about computers sitting on desks. It was about connections, invisible threads linking every human being into one shared digital fabric. In the early 1990s, Bill had seen glimpses of this future, but like many giants, Microsoft had been slow to adapt. The company that once led every wave of innovation suddenly found itself chasing it. The world was moving online, and others were moving faster. Startups like Yahoo, Amazon, and Google were emerging, each powered by the limitless energy of the Internet. The new pioneers weren't selling software. They were selling access, information, and experience. For Bill Gates, the Internet was both a challenge and a calling. He saw in it not just competition, but opportunity, a platform that could extend his lifelong dream of empowering every person on Earth. In 1995, he wrote his now famous memo titled "The Internet Tidal Wave." In it, he declared that the web was the most important development since the personal computer, and that Microsoft must pivot or risk irrelevance. It was a wake-up call that echoed through every hallway of the company. Teams scrambled to adapt. Microsoft restructured its entire strategy around the Internet, building Internet Explorer, launching MSN, and investing in online infrastructure. It was an immense shift for a company built on selling boxed software. And though it came late, it came with force. Bill's leadership, as always, was relentless. He knew that survival meant transformation. But even as Microsoft evolved, the landscape was changing faster than anyone could control. The Internet democratized technology in ways the world had never seen. Anyone, anywhere, could create, share, and build. The same openness that inspired Bill's early vision now made it impossible for any one company, even Microsoft, to hold the center of power. The world of technology had broken free from its gatekeepers. For Bill, this shift was profound. It was humbling, even beautiful. The digital revolution he helped start had grown beyond him, spreading power into the hands of millions. The tools he dreamed of, once confined to offices and universities, were now shaping lives in villages, schools, and homes across the globe. The Internet made the world smaller, faster, and more connected, and it reminded him that innovation, by its nature, cannot be owned, only guided. Yet the rise of the Internet also revealed a new kind of challenge. Alongside the explosion of information came misinformation. Alongside opportunity came inequality. The gap between those with access to the web and those without grew wider. Bill saw this clearly, and it struck something deep within him. Technology had always been his passion, but now he began to see it as a moral responsibility. He started to think less about products and more about people, about how access to information could transform education, health, and development. The Internet was more than a business revolution. It was a human one. And as he stepped further away from Microsoft's boardrooms and deeper into global philanthropy, Bill carried this realization with him. The web was the world's greatest equalizer, but only if everyone could reach it. The rise of the Internet marked a turning point in Bill Gates's journey. It was the moment he began to shift from building systems for computers to building systems for humanity. He had spent decades teaching the world how to think digitally. Now, he was learning how to think globally. And as the Internet age accelerated into a new century, Bill Gates, once the architect of the PC revolution, was beginning to build something even larger, a bridge between technology and compassion. The world was changing, and so was Bill Gates. For decades, he had lived in a world of algorithms, deadlines, and innovation, a world where progress was measured in lines of code and market share. But as he stepped further into the 21st century, something inside him began to shift. The man who once believed technology could solve everything started to realize that the deepest problems weren't just technical, they were human. In the early 2000s, after years of leading Microsoft through both triumph and turmoil, Bill found himself asking a question he had never asked before. What truly matters now? He had built one of the most powerful companies in history, helped create the digital age, and changed how the world worked and learned. Yet, in the quiet moments, he sensed that his greatest challenge might still be ahead, one that had nothing to do with computers at all. That realization didn't come suddenly. It grew slowly, shaped by the world around him. He saw reports of millions of children dying from preventable diseases. He read stories of families living without clean water and of schools without books or electricity. The very tools that made the world more connected also revealed how unequal it truly was. Bill began to see the limits of technology when disconnected from humanity. At the same time, his partner in life, Melinda, shared that same growing concern. Together they began having deeper conversations about the purpose of wealth, success, and impact. They wondered, what if all the brilliance, structure, and energy that had built Microsoft could be redirected towards solving the world's biggest problems? What if innovation could save not just companies, but lives? That question became the seed of something extraordinary. In 2000, Bill and Melinda Gates launched the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a monumental step that would redefine his legacy. It was not an extension of Microsoft, it was a transformation of his purpose. The foundation was built with a simple but powerful idea. Every life has equal value. It was a statement that carried the weight of both logic and love. For Bill, the transition from CEO to philanthropist wasn't easy. He had to unlearn the pace of Silicon Valley and embrace the patience of the real world. Solving poverty or disease didn't follow the same rules as debugging software. Progress came in decades, not quarters. And yet, this was the challenge that reignited his curiosity, the kind that kept him awake at night. He was no longer coding programs, he was trying to code hope. In those years, Bill's office changed from sleek boardrooms to rural clinics and remote villages. He met scientists, farmers, teachers, and doctors, the new heroes of his story. Each encounter reminded him that progress wasn't about brilliance alone, but about empathy, listening, and persistence. The same drive that once fueled his ambition now powered his compassion. Still, the shift didn't mean leaving his old self behind. Bill's analytical mind became one of the Foundation's greatest tools. He approached philanthropy like engineering, identifying bottlenecks, measuring outcomes, and scaling what worked. He believed that saving lives could be as systematic as building software if humanity applied the same rigor and innovation. And slowly, the results began to show. Vaccines reached millions of children. Entire regions saw declining rates of malaria and polio. New investments in education and agriculture began to lift communities out of poverty. The scale was immense, and so was the learning curve. Bill was no longer the richest man chasing the future. He was a student again, studying how to make a difference that lasted. This new chapter wasn't about dominance or disruption. It was about balance between logic and empathy, wealth and responsibility, innovation and humanity. Bill had once dreamed of putting a computer on every desk. Now he dreamed of giving every child a chance at life. The mission had evolved, but the spirit remained the same: belief in human potential. And in that quiet transformation, Bill Gates discovered something profound. He realized that beyond code, beyond money, and beyond power, the greatest thing one could build was a world that cared. The same precision that created Microsoft was now rebuilding lives, one idea, one act, and one person at a time. He had built an empire of machines. Now he was building a legacy of meaning. By the late 1990s, the world knew Bill Gates as the face of Microsoft, the world's richest man, the architect of the digital revolution, and the symbol of modern ambition. Yet behind the scenes, Bill and Melinda were quietly working on something that would change not just their lives, but millions of others. What began as a simple desire to give back evolved into one of the most influential philanthropic institutions in human history. It all started with a letter, not from a CEO or a world leader, but from a mother in Africa. She wrote about her struggle to keep her children alive in a place where medicine was scarce and hope even rarer. The letter struck a chord deep within Bill. He had always been a man driven by data and logic, but this was something different, something that statistics alone couldn't explain. It was a reminder that every number represented a life, a story, a family. Around the same time, Bill read a World Health Organization report that revealed millions of children were dying each year from diseases that could easily be prevented with affordable vaccines. The sheer injustice of it haunted him. Here was a man who had helped build a trillion-dollar industry, yet even he couldn't accept that wealth and innovation were still failing the people who needed them most. In 2000, Bill and Melinda made a decision that would redefine philanthropy itself. They officially founded the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, merging several earlier charitable efforts under one powerful mission: to help every person live a healthy and productive life. It was born not out of guilt, but out of purpose, a sense that success should mean more than accumulation. It should mean contribution. Unlike many charitable organizations before it, the Gates Foundation didn't follow the traditional approach of giving money and hoping for results. Bill applied the same disciplined thinking that had built Microsoft. He wanted measurable impact, strategic planning, and scalable solutions. He believed that charity needed to be as data-driven as technology, precise, efficient, and accountable. Melinda, on the other hand, brought empathy and perspective. She insisted that behind every number was a human being with dignity and dreams. Together they formed a perfect balance: intellect and compassion, logic and love. It was this harmony that made their foundation unique. Bill analyzed the problems. Melinda humanized them. The foundation began focusing on a few key areas where it believed it could make the biggest difference: global health, education, and poverty reduction. Early on, they invested heavily in vaccine research and delivery, forming partnerships with organizations like the WHO and UNICEF. Their goal wasn't to reinvent medicine, it was to make it accessible to everyone, everywhere. The results were astonishing. In less than a decade, diseases like polio and malaria saw historic declines. Millions of children who might have died now had a chance at life. For Bill, these outcomes were more rewarding than any business success. He once said that no software launch could compare to the moment he met a child whose life had been saved because of their foundation's work. But the path wasn't without criticism. Some questioned whether a single foundation, run by billionaires, should wield so much influence over global health and education. Others accused them of using philanthropy to repair the image of capitalism. Bill, however, rarely responded to such claims. For him, results spoke louder than debates. The only question that mattered was, did this action make someone's life better? Inside the foundation, the atmosphere was not unlike Microsoft's early days. There was a sense of urgency, of building something world-changing. Scientists, economists, and educators worked together with a shared mission to innovate for humanity. Bill encouraged experimentation, analysis, and long-term thinking, traits that once shaped software now shaped hope. As the foundation grew, so did Bill's understanding of the world. He traveled to remote villages in Africa and Asia, where he saw both the beauty of resilience and the pain of inequality. These journeys humbled him. They reminded him that while technology could empower, it could not replace compassion. The world's problems weren't just about access to tools, they were about fairness, empathy, and leadership. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation soon became a global symbol of modern philanthropy. Its influence reached governments, universities, and other billionaires, inspiring a new generation of donors to think not about charity, but about change. Bill and Melinda weren't just giving away money. They were designing systems to give people a future. And yet, amidst all this, Bill remained the same curious boy who once stayed up late exploring computer code. Only now, the code he was trying to write wasn't made of symbols or syntax. It was written in compassion, science, and faith in humanity. The foundation wasn't just a project. It was a reflection of everything he had learned, that the true purpose of knowledge was not power, but service. In a world still filled with division and inequality, Bill Gates was proving that intellect, when guided by empathy, could become the most powerful force of all. As the new millennium unfolded, Bill Gates stood at a crossroads. For decades, power had been his natural environment, the authority to shape industries, guide innovation, and command the attention of the entire tech world. But now his ambitions were turning inward. The man who once defined success by control began to seek meaning in surrender. He was learning that the most powerful act was not holding on, but letting go. After stepping down as Microsoft's CEO in 2000, Bill faced a silence he hadn't heard in years. For the first time, there were no product launches to plan, no software deadlines looming, no competitors to outsmart. That quiet was uncomfortable at first. His mind, wired for challenge, searched for purpose in a life that had already achieved more than most could dream of. Yet it was within that quiet that his new identity began to take shape. Bill no longer wanted to be remembered only as a brilliant technologist. He wanted to be remembered as a force for good. The wealth and influence he had accumulated now felt less like rewards and more like responsibilities. He understood that success without service was hollow, and that true fulfillment came not from being the smartest in the room, but from using that intelligence to make life better for others. Melinda played a central role in this transformation. Her compassion grounded his logic. Her warmth softened his intensity. Together, they began traveling to some of the world's most forgotten corners, places without electricity, clean water, or basic health care. The experiences were humbling. They met mothers who walked miles for medicine, children who learned under trees, and doctors who worked miracles with almost nothing. Every encounter reshaped Bill's understanding of progress. He realized that the world didn't need more technology alone. It needed fairness. It needed empathy. It needed leaders who saw beyond profit and competition, who saw humanity itself. This realization didn't make him less ambitious. If anything, it fueled a new kind of ambition, one driven not by dominance, but by impact. The man who once dreamed of putting a computer on every desk now dreamed of saving lives in every corner of the world. Bill began to measure his success differently. Instead of market share, he tracked lives improved. Instead of user numbers, he counted children vaccinated. Instead of shareholder value, he looked at human value. And slowly, that shift began to heal something within him. The endless race to be first was replaced by a purpose that had no finish line. Yet, this transformation didn't erase the old Bill Gates. His relentless curiosity, his obsession with optimization, and his belief in systems all found a new outlet in the Gates Foundation. He brought the same precision to philanthropy that he once brought to code. Every initiative was studied, every outcome measured, every failure analyzed. But this time, the stakes weren't about business. They were about survival. One of the Foundation's most ambitious missions was eradicating diseases like malaria and polio. The work required coordination across countries, cultures, and governments, a challenge far more complex than any software project. But Bill approached it with the same conviction he once had for technology, that with enough intelligence and persistence, humanity could solve anything. Still, the work changed him in ways numbers couldn't capture. He began speaking not just of efficiency, but of empathy, not just of progress, but of dignity. He saw that the world's problems were intertwined, that health, education, and poverty were not separate issues, but part of one great human equation. And the answer, he realized, wasn't innovation alone, but compassion multiplied by courage. The transition from power to purpose also brought peace. Bill no longer needed to prove himself. The empire he had built was stable. The future of Microsoft was secure. What mattered now was legacy, not the kind etched in stock charts or headlines, but the kind written in the quiet gratitude of people who would never know his name. And in this shift, Bill found something unexpected: joy. Joy in solving problems that couldn't be automated, joy in helping strangers, joy in knowing that his life's work was no longer about him. He often said that optimism was the most radical thing a person could be, that even when the world seemed broken, progress was possible, not through miracles, but through patience and persistence. He believed that humanity's future depended on one simple truth, that those with power must use it for purpose. In stepping away from the company that made him powerful, Bill Gates discovered what made him human, and in doing so, he reminded the world that intelligence without compassion is incomplete, that the true measure of genius lies not in creation, but in contribution. He had mastered the art of building machines. Now he was learning the deeper art, building meaning. In the quiet rhythm of later years, Bill Gates began to see his own life with new clarity. For decades, he had lived at a speed most people could never imagine, chasing innovation, driving change, and pushing himself beyond exhaustion. Yet as he stepped back and looked across the arc of his journey, he realized that his greatest lessons hadn't come from success at all. They had come from failure. For much of his life, failure was an unfamiliar visitor. From his teenage years at Lakeside to his reign at Microsoft, Bill's story had been one of relentless momentum. When others stumbled, he accelerated. When others hesitated, he acted. But even the sharpest minds eventually meet limits. The antitrust trial, public criticism, and changing tides of technology had all humbled him. These moments, though painful, became mirrors, reflections that showed him who he truly was beneath the brilliance. He learned that success is not a straight line, but a cycle. Every breakthrough carries a blind spot. Every triumph carries a cost. The real challenge is not in avoiding mistakes, but in recognizing what they reveal. Bill began to see that his early obsession with perfection, with control, had sometimes cost him empathy. The same focus that built Microsoft had also built walls between himself and others. Over time, those walls began to crack, and through them came understanding. He started to view failure differently, not as loss, but as data. To a mind trained in logic, every mistake was a lesson in disguise. He studied not only his own missteps, but those of history's greatest innovators. From Thomas Edison to Steve Jobs, he saw a pattern that those who shaped the world were never defined by how they succeeded, but by how they adapted. It was in the recalibration, the quiet correction after chaos, that progress truly happened. When asked in interviews about regret, Bill rarely spoke of business. His reflections were more personal. He wished he had listened more, been more patient. He acknowledged that during Microsoft's rise, he had sometimes pushed people too hard, not out of cruelty, but out of an unrelenting belief in what could be achieved. With age came the realization that innovation without empathy leaves a hollow echo. From failure, he also learned humility, the understanding that no one changes the world alone. Microsoft was built not by one genius, but by thousands of hands, hearts, and minds working together. In his later years, he began to celebrate teamwork more openly. He gave credit freely, especially to those who had challenged him. He came to value dissent, understanding that disagreement is often the birthplace of growth. And from success, he learned responsibility. The wealth he accumulated wasn't a trophy. It was a tool, a means to extend opportunity to others. Bill often said that money had no real meaning unless it was used to solve real problems. He believed that privilege came with obligation, that those who could see farther had the duty to build ladders for those still climbing. In his speeches, his voice carried less certainty and more contemplation. Gone was the fire of the young CEO demanding precision. In its place was the calm of a man who had seen enough to know that control is an illusion, but compassion is a choice. He spoke not as a conqueror of industries, but as a student of life, one still learning, still evolving, still searching for better questions. The contrast between his early and later years was striking. The boy who once measured success in lines of code now measured it in lives touched. The young man who competed for dominance had grown into an elder statesman advocating for cooperation. His story had not lost its sharpness. It had simply gained depth. Bill Gates's life, in the end, became a study of balance, of intellect and empathy, power and purpose, creation and reflection. His greatest legacy was not the company he built, but the perspective he gained along the way. He proved that even the most logical minds must eventually learn the language of the heart, because in the equation of life, success is only half the answer. The rest lies in what we learn when the world stops applauding. Long before Microsoft became a global empire, there were two boys sitting in front of a teletype terminal at Lakeside School, Bill Gates and Paul Allen. What united them wasn't ambition or fame, it was curiosity. They weren't trying to change the world back then. They just wanted to understand it. In that dimly lit computer room, they found something that felt almost magical, the power to make a machine obey thought. It was the beginning of a friendship that would outlast even the company they built together. Through the 1970s and early 1980s, Bill and Paul were inseparable. They dreamed big, worked endlessly, and challenged each other constantly. Paul was the quiet visionary, a thinker who saw possibilities beyond the moment. Bill was the strategist, sharp and relentless, who turned those visions into reality. Together they formed a perfect balance, logic and imagination, precision and wonder. Microsoft was not born out of greed or competition. It was born out of shared fascination. But as the company grew, the pressure mounted. The same intensity that made Microsoft unstoppable began to strain their bond. Bill's drive to perfect every detail often collided with Paul's gentler temperament. When Paul fell ill with Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1982, he began to see life differently. And Microsoft's ruthless pace no longer felt like his world. The distance between the two friends widened. Eventually, Paul left the company they had built together. To the public, it looked like the end of an era. But privately, it was just the beginning of a long silence filled with reflection. For years, Bill and Paul took separate paths. Bill dove deeper into Microsoft, steering it into the future. Paul pursued new passions, investing in technology, music, space exploration, and sports. They rarely spoke during that time, yet their connection never disappeared. Each man carried the other's influence like a quiet echo. Bill's precision was born from Paul's creativity, and Paul's courage was shaped by Bill's determination. It wasn't until much later, after the storms of business and the weight of fame had settled, that the two reconnected. Time had softened the sharp edges of their youth. Bill reached out, acknowledging the bond that had built his life. When Paul released his memoir, Idea Man, Bill read it with humility, recognizing not just the successes, but the humanity behind their journey. The book didn't rekindle old conflict, it brought closure. It reminded them both of where everything began, not in an office, but in friendship. When Paul Allen passed away in 2018, Bill's tribute was simple yet deeply heartfelt. He wrote, "From our early days together at Lakeside, through our partnership in building Microsoft, to seeing the world through his wide curiosity and love of music, I could not have asked for a better friend." Those words revealed something that years of headlines had missed, that beyond the empire, beyond the legend, there was still a boy who missed his friend. The story of Bill and Paul is more than a story of invention. It's a story about the fragility of human connection, about how ambition can test it and time can heal it. Their friendship was proof that even the greatest visions are born from something simple. Two minds curious about the same dream. In the end, what they created wasn't just software or a company. It was a bridge between imagination and reality, between friendship and purpose. The computers, the code, the billions, they were all outcomes, but the origin was human, and even after Paul was gone, his presence lingered. In the values, in the company, in the quiet gratitude of a man who learned that true success isn't what you build, but who you build it with. For Bill Gates, that friendship was never about technology. It was about the shared belief that the future could be written, and that it could be written together. When Bill Gates stepped away from Microsoft, many believed his story had reached its peak. The young prodigy who revolutionized personal computing had achieved everything most people could ever dream of. Yet for Bill, that moment wasn't an ending. It was a turning point. His first act had been about building technology. His second would be about building hope. Philanthropy had always existed in whispers throughout his career, but now it became the central purpose of his life. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, once a quiet project, transformed into one of the most powerful humanitarian organizations in history. It wasn't just about giving. It was about changing the way giving worked. Bill approached philanthropy with the same logic he had used to design software. Define the problem, find the data, and build a system that scales. But Melinda brought something that data couldn't measure: empathy. Where Bill saw challenges, she saw faces. Together, they forged a partnership unlike any other in the world of philanthropy. She grounded him when logic became cold. He empowered her when hope seemed impossible. Their shared vision gave the foundation a rare balance between intellect and compassion. They focused on three of humanity's greatest challenges: health, education, and poverty. Each carried staggering complexity. In Africa and South Asia, they funded vaccine research, eradicated diseases like polio and malaria, and helped millions of children survive past infancy. In the United States, they championed better education, believing that every student deserved a fair chance to learn. In poor communities worldwide, they invested in agricultural innovation to help families grow enough to feed themselves. For Bill, philanthropy was not an escape from technology. It was an evolution of it. The same curiosity that once drove him to improve software now drove him to improve systems of healthcare and education. He studied global logistics, data patterns, and public health models with the same intensity he once applied to code. To him, solving the world's biggest problems was the ultimate engineering challenge. The foundation didn't operate like a traditional charity. It was a laboratory for social innovation. Every project was measured, tested, and refined. Mistakes weren't failures. They were feedback. And behind every success story were thousands of small experiments. From rural villages to global conferences, the foundation's influence grew, not through slogans, but through results. Still, not everyone admired their approach. Critics argued that one foundation should not have so much influence over global policy. Others questioned whether billionaires could ever truly solve problems created by inequality itself. Bill listened but rarely responded with words. Instead, he responded with evidence, with charts showing declining child mortality, rising vaccination rates, and the steady erosion of preventable diseases. As the years passed, Bill and Melinda's partnership became a symbol of modern philanthropy. They weren't saviors, they were students, constantly learning from the people they sought to help. Bill often spoke about how traveling to rural clinics or schools gave him perspective. The lives he encountered grounded him, reminded him that progress wasn't measured in profits or prestige, but in quiet victories. A cured child, an educated girl, a thriving family. In 2021, when Bill and Melinda announced their divorce, the world was stunned. Yet even through personal change, they remained united in purpose. The foundation they built together endured, proof that shared ideals can outlast even personal transitions. In interviews, Bill spoke with gratitude, not regret. He said that their work together had been one of the most meaningful parts of his life. Philanthropy had become his mirror, reflecting both his achievements and his humanity. It reminded him that no amount of innovation could replace kindness, and no amount of logic could replace love. Through his second act, Bill Gates discovered that purpose is not something you find once. It's something you keep redefining as you grow. And while the world still remembered him as the man who built Microsoft, Bill began to see himself differently, not as a titan of technology, but as a student of compassion. His second act wasn't about leading a company. It was about leading by example. Because the greatest code he ever wrote was not for machines, but for mankind. As the world stepped into a new century of innovation, Bill Gates found himself once again at the intersection of technology and destiny. But this time, he wasn't leading from the front lines of the software wars. He was watching from a distance, thoughtful, reflective, and cautious. The boy who once dreamed of computers on every desk now pondered the consequences of that dream fulfilled. Technology had delivered wonders beyond imagination, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, renewable energy, yet it had also brought new dilemmas. Misinformation spread faster than truth. Automation threatened livelihoods. The same connectivity that united humanity sometimes divided it more deeply. Bill understood that the age of invention had evolved into the age of responsibility. Innovation was no longer about what we could do. It was about what we should do. He began to speak more often about the ethical future of technology. In interviews and conferences, his tone was calm but firm. He warned that the tools humanity created could just as easily build or break civilization. Artificial intelligence, in particular, fascinated and frightened him. He saw in it echoes of his own ambition, limitless potential, but unpredictable outcomes. AI could be our greatest achievement, he once said, or our biggest mistake. It depends on how wisely we guide it. This awareness didn't come from fear, but from perspective. Having witnessed the rise of personal computing, the birth of the Internet, and the explosion of digital power, Bill knew that progress always carried a price. Every leap forward reshaped society in ways no one could fully control. The question, he believed, was whether humanity could evolve as quickly as its machines. Outside of technology, his focus turned increasingly toward climate change, a problem that demanded both innovation and empathy. He poured time and resources into renewable energy research, advocating for breakthroughs that could power the planet without destroying it. His book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, wasn't written as a billionaire's manifesto, but as an engineer's blueprint, logical, data-driven, yet deeply human. He believed that solving climate change required the same mindset that built Microsoft: relentless problem-solving, collaboration, and faith in human creativity. Bill's vision for the future wasn't utopian. It was pragmatic, grounded in the belief that progress must always serve people, not replace them. He imagined a world where technology amplified compassion rather than competition, where innovation meant empowerment, not control. He often said that the next great revolution wouldn't come from faster processors or smarter algorithms, but from wiser humans. As he aged, Bill found himself playing a different kind of role, that of a mentor. Young entrepreneurs sought his advice not just on business, but on balance. He told them that success without self-awareness leads to emptiness, and that intelligence without empathy leads to isolation. The lessons of his life had become lessons for a generation, reminders that even the brightest minds need humility to guide their power. Through his foundation and global initiatives, Bill continued to push boundaries in science and sustainability, but his focus shifted from dominance to collaboration. He knew that no single genius, company, or nation could solve the challenges ahead. The future, he often said, would belong to those who could combine reason with compassion, who could think globally but act humanely. In quiet moments, away from the headlines, Bill still read, wrote, and learned. He never lost his curiosity, but it had transformed. The questions that once began with, "How do we build this?" now began with, "Why should we?" That subtle shift marked the evolution of a man who had grown beyond invention into introspection. Bill Gates's journey from prodigy to philanthropist, from coder to conscience, revealed a truth that transcends technology. That progress is not defined by what we create, but by what we choose to care about. The machines may grow smarter, but it is wisdom, not intelligence, that will decide the fate of humanity. And as he looked to the horizon of an uncertain future, Bill carried with him not the urgency of youth, but the calm of understanding, for he had learned that the true purpose of innovation was not to outsmart the world, but to uplift it. When history looks back on the life of Bill Gates, it will see more than a billionaire, more than a CEO, and more than a philanthropist. It will see the arc of a man who began with curiosity and ended with conscience, a journey from control to compassion, from code to humanity. For all his success, Bill's legacy cannot be confined to Microsoft or even the foundation that bears his name. It lives instead in the subtle ways he reshaped how the world thinks, works, and dreams. He was, above all, a coder, not just of software, but of systems and ideas. His true gift was seeing patterns where others saw chaos. The same instinct that let him optimize lines of code helped him later reimagine global health and education. To him, the world itself was a kind of program, one that could always be improved, debugged, rewritten. Yet, unlike most programmers, he learned that not every problem can be solved by logic alone. Some require patience, others require heart. Bill's story reminds us that genius and imperfection often live side by side. He could be impatient, stubborn, and exacting, traits that drove him to greatness, but also cost him peace. Yet in those imperfections lay the humanity that made his journey meaningful. The drive that once sought to dominate industries eventually turned inward, teaching him humility. The same hunger for progress that defined his youth found new expression in service to others. He often said that success was a poor teacher. It seduced smart people into thinking they couldn't fail. With age, he came to see that failure and the humility it brings was what truly shaped character. This realization transformed how he measured his life, no longer by profits or market share, but by impact, not by the number of users, but by the number of lives improved. As he grew older, Bill became less interested in being remembered for what he built and more interested in how others would build after him. He devoted increasing time to mentoring young innovators and philanthropists, urging them to use their talents responsibly. He believed that the true measure of intelligence was not in brilliance, but in the ability to care, to think big while remembering the small, to dream boldly but act kindly. Even after decades of fame, he never stopped being that curious boy from Lakeside, the one who loved puzzles, ideas, and possibilities. He still spent hours reading, learning, questioning. His fascination with the future never faded, but his understanding of it deepened. The older he became, the more he realized that technology was not humanity's destination, it was merely its reflection. In the final stretch of his life's work, Bill Gates began to embody a quiet truth, that legacies are not written in headlines or history books. They're written in habits, in the small, consistent acts of thoughtfulness that ripple outward, the vaccines that save a life, the scholarship that changes a family's future, the idea that sparks a new invention. These were the true codes he wrote, invisible but enduring. To the world, he will always be the man who helped put a computer in every home. But to those who look deeper, his story is something more profound. It is a reminder that intellect is only half of greatness. The other half is empathy, that the power to create means little without the wisdom to uplift. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary part of his legacy, that the boy who once taught machines to think spent the rest of his life teaching humans to care. Because when the code of history runs and the data of lives intertwine, the measure of a man is not in what he invented, but in what he inspired. As we reach the quiet end of this story, we step back and look at the man who stood at the center of it all. Bill Gates, a boy with a curious mind who grew into one of the most influential figures in modern history. His journey was never just about computers. It was about the pursuit of understanding, of systems, of society, and ultimately of himself. From his early days in the Lakeside Computer Lab to the towering success of Microsoft, Bill's life teaches us that curiosity is the first spark of creation. He didn't set out to be rich or famous. He simply wanted to solve problems. Every invention, every breakthrough began with a question, and it reminds us that even the greatest revolutions begin not with certainty, but with wonder. But his story also teaches the cost of ambition. Success, while dazzling, can isolate. The same drive that fuels achievement can blind us to the world around us. Bill's early years were marked by competition, a relentless need to win, to perfect, to prove. Yet time has a way of humbling even the brightest minds. Through mistakes and missteps, he discovered that control is not the same as meaning, that winning every battle can still leave you feeling lost. What changed him wasn't failure, it was reflection. It was the quiet realization that the same brilliance used to build machines could be used to heal lives. His journey from code to compassion stands as one of the most profound transformations in modern memory. He showed that intellect alone changes industries, but empathy changes the world. Through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he learned a truth that logic alone could never reveal, that every statistic hides a story, and every number represents a beating heart. The world's problems cannot be solved by data alone. They require human understanding, and Bill's second act, his work in global health and education, became proof that greatness is not measured by how much we take, but by how much we give back. There's also a deeper lesson here, one that speaks to all of us living in a world shaped by the technologies he helped create. Progress is powerful, but it is not neutral. It mirrors our choices, our values, our humanity. Bill's later reflections remind us that the question is no longer, what can we build? It's what should we build? In a time when machines grow smarter every day, his legacy calls us to grow wiser, to lead with reason but never lose compassion, to innovate not for control but for care, to remember that the true measure of intelligence is empathy, and that the future belongs to those who understand both. Bill Gates's story is not a fairy tale, nor a perfect blueprint. It is a mirror, showing the brilliance, the flaws, the contradictions that live within all of us. It is proof that people can evolve, that visionaries can learn to listen, and that even those who change the world must learn to be changed by it. So, as we close this chapter, perhaps the lesson is simple. Success fades, wealth shifts, technology evolves, but kindness endures, curiosity continues, and the legacy of one mind, guided by both logic and love, can ripple quietly through generations. Because in the end, the greatest code we can write is not for a machine, it's for humanity itself.